Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Costs on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, steel yourself. The metal is found everywhere, from bridges to your kitchen sink, but the global steel industry is going through its worst downturn in 50 years. From Port Talbot in Wales to China's Hebei province, we'll look at the inner workings and decline of the steel economy. And speaking of China, there are signs its downturn might be levelling off. China is, of course, the engine of global growth, and the International Monetary Fund's just upgraded its outlook while cutting forecasts for the rest of the world. Plus Lebanon, a tiny Mediterranean economy already under pressure from the war in Syria, and now dealing with a travel ban from the Gulf countries. So remember the oil paradigm we've been talking about for months now. Higher production plus lower demand equals tumbling prices. Well, apply that to steel as well. We've really started to see some problems emerge in the steel industry recently, from a small town in Wales all the way to China. China is the world's biggest producer and consumer of steel, and as such is calling for global cooperation to wrestle with the problems the industry is facing. Here's how it looks. Hot-rolled coil exported from China slumped as low as $260 a tonne in December, down from a record $1,120 in June of 2008. Now, hot-rolled coil is used in everything from refrigerators to cars. That's, of course, bad news for steel makers who can't make a profit. One Chinese company described the demand shock as an ice age, with the term sunset industry being thrown around. That is, it's not likely to recover. But while China's calling for cooperation, many actually blame China's steel mill for flooding the market with cheap supply. But steelmakers there are suffering too. When China outlined its latest 5-year plan, it said more job cuts in the steel sector were likely. And over in the UK, Tata Steel, an Indian company, put its entire business up for sale. It too blamed cheap imports from China for the decision. Thousands of jobs were at risk, but in the end, investment firm Grable Capital snapped up the steelworks for the very low price of £1 British pound. So that's where we'll start. The UK, the world's oldest and once its largest steel industry, on the verge of collapse. And that means 14,000 jobs at risk. Barnaby Phillips went to Port Talbot in South Wales, home to Britain's biggest steel plant.
The steelworks dwarf the town that lies next to it. In Port Talbot, everything depends on steel. They've been making it here for more than 100 years. But the plant is now losing $1.5 million every day, and history won't be enough to save it.
It would be like losing a member of the family for most people. Generations have worked here. The town itself would be devastated. The town exists because of the steelworks. If fathers, sons, grandfathers have worked here, even the local businesses rely on the steelworks for support, even down to the local post offices and corner shops. This went, there wouldn't be a Port Talbot.
At one level, the crisis in the British steel industry is part of a very old and familiar story. That is the slow death of heavy industry in the country where the Industrial Revolution began. But it's also a crisis with a very contemporary twist. British steel is in such difficulty now because of a huge glut of cheap Chinese steel, which is having an economic impact right across the world.
They may blame China, but that's not the whole story. The workers and the Welsh government believe that if only the UK government in London had been more protective of the steel industry, we wouldn't be in this situation.
The reasons, of course, why other countries have become competitive are to do with energy prices. That can be dealt with within the UK. Of tariffs, we know that they've been imposed all over the world in different countries. That makes a difference as well. So there's no intrinsic permanent issue in the UK that makes it particularly difficult to manufacture steel in the UK. There are issues that can be dealt with to improve the competitiveness of the UK steel industry.
What do you aim to achieve?
Belated action from the UK government, a hurried journey to Mumbai by the business secretary, where Tata promised it will allow a reasonable amount of time for new buyers to come forward. But even the proposed rescue plans would involve job losses. In truth, Port Talbot has been going through hard times for decades. Steel employs 1/5 of the workforce that it did back in the 1960s. Now, They fear even worse times to come.
So as we see there, a lot of the steel market's woes seem to start in China. That is where the blame starts, it seems. Chinese companies have been accused of getting rid of their excess steel stock by selling it cheaply on the global market. But, as Florence Louis reports from Wuhan in Hubei province, that is not a long-term solution.
15 years ago, Fan Bin followed in his father's footsteps and joined one of China's biggest steel and iron producers. It was considered a stable job with good prospects. Not anymore. 6 months ago, he took a severance package. He now works in a factory that produces metal structures for construction sites, but says he's still worried about job security.
I'm very confused now. In the past, when I worked for Wuhan Steel Factory, even though I wasn't paid much, at least I had a guaranteed job. Now I don't have a stable job. I had to find a new job on my own. And even Wuhan Steel is in bad shape. So what am I going to do?
China's economy is slowing down. Last year, the economy grew at its slowest pace in 25 years. As a consequence, the demand for raw materials such as steel has fallen. Its factories, however, are still humming along, churning out products but with fewer and fewer buyers. To get rid of the overcapacity, China's been exporting its steel at low prices. But economists say that's only a short-term solution. In the longer run, Chinese companies will need to restructure to be more efficient.
This is a painful process that any country, when it modernizes and wants to have more efficient industries, just needs to do. We saw it in the UK, we saw it in the US, Germany, Japan, all around the world. Eventually, economies have to face this reality. So the best thing for China to do would be to swallow the bitter pill and make its steel industry more competitive.
More competitive means not just reducing output, but also costs. Wuhan Iron and Steel is one of China's biggest and oldest steel producers. It's recently announced it will slash its workforce by 60%. As many as 50,000 people will lose their jobs over the next few years. At a nearby restaurant, some workers stop for a meal before they begin their next shift. They don't want to speak to us on camera, but tell us they're worried. One man says he's had to take a 25% pay cut. It's a far cry from the steel industry's heyday, when the company could afford to plough its profits back into the community, building schools, a hospital, even a museum. Now its employees hang on to an uncertain future.
Yes, uncertain future seems to be the catch cry everywhere. Let's tie it all together with Russell Jones joining us from London. He's a partner at Llewellyn Consulting. Russell, the steel story's been big in the UK in the last few weeks, I know, and we'll get to that later. But I want to start with the bottom line, and that is the price. It is basically the oil story transposed into steel, isn't it? Weak demand, lots of oversupply, and the price takes a hit.
That's absolutely right. In economic terms, it's explained by the interaction of supply and demand. At the moment, there's a huge amount of oversupply, not least because of what China's doing. And then we have very weak global economic activity at the moment. In particular, what you've seen over the last few years is a slowdown in the emerging market world, and they tend to consume or have done over previous years a great deal of steel, and that demand is now slackening off. And the net result is that steel prices have fallen very sharply indeed.
Okay, so you said there with what China's doing. Let's stay with that for a moment, talk that through. The huge oversupply there, obviously, and the accusations that they're flooding the market with cheap steel. Why?
China's in a very challenging situation at the moment. This is an economy which is desperately trying to restructure itself from exports and heavy industry and towards consumer spending and services. But that process tends to take a good deal of time. And in the interim, there's an awful lot of overcapacity, not least in the heavy industrial sector, and steel is a very large component of that. While they're winding that capacity down, there is a tendency to try and sell as much as this excess capacity as they can, and it tends to move overseas. And the net result is that prices have been extremely weak now for some time.
Any thoughts then about, I know it's dangerous to get into crystal ball gazing territory, but where those prices might be heading? Is it going to stay like this for some time to come?
Well, if we look at the two major considerations, supply and demand, I don't think the demand situation is going to improve very much for some time. The IMF's recent World Economic Outlook is still looking at a very hesitant and uneven picture for global economic growth, and I would side with that. On the supply side, as I hinted, this process of structural adjustment doesn't feel like it's in any way complete yet. So my sense is that we are going to be locked into a period of relatively low prices for the foreseeable future.
Okay, you are in the UK, so let's talk about what's happened at Port Talbot in Wales. It seemed to me, certainly from the UK media coverage that I saw, that it was a very, very emotive story. You know, the fate of thousands of workers. Can you tell us, though, about the particular problems which face that factory there, the economic problems, I guess, and business problems, and the company behind it?
I think, as you suggested, this is a very vexed issue, and it encroaches not just onto the ground of economics. There are also enormous social and political considerations to bear in mind as well. Frankly speaking, in pure economic terms, the case for the UK to produce steel, apart from in a very specialised sector, or maybe for security reasons, is extraordinarily thin. Britain is a very high cost producer of steel. We can produce at a level which is perhaps 10 times higher than China in terms of cost. Some of the statistics are quite extraordinary. China's produced more steel in the last 2 years than Britain has since 1870, for example. So the economic case for production of steel is, as I say, a very slim one. But of course, winding down the industry involves enormous social and political costs. Whole communities, not least those in South Wales, are under threat, and that process has to be managed. Any government has to provide a safety net for the employees which are let go. Any reasonable government also has to put in place incentives for new businesses to spring up, and retraining of the people who are made redundant. It's a complex process, and it's one which the government is struggling with at the moment. And as I said, no doubt there will be political costs involved in it.
And the owners, Tata Steel, I mean, again, on the emotive side of the story, they end up looking like the bad guys because they're the ones who are selling up. But I wonder if it's just a business reality for them and that they're facing very tough times in a difficult industry.
I think in truth, given the economics of it, it's not at all surprising that they've decided to pull out. They have invested a lot of money in Port Talbot, there's no doubt about that, but they're still making losses which are accumulating at a remarkable rate. So one can understand their decision from a pure corporate business level. But of course, as I've suggested, you know, you've then got these broader considerations to bear in mind. And they're extremely painful for the communities involved and extremely challenging for the politicians involved.
Russell Jones with his insight on the steel industry there. Thank you for that, Russell.
Okay, pleasure.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we're up amongst the skyscrapers of Hong Kong, where property prices are generally just as high, but something's bringing those prices down. We'll find out a little later on. Right now, though, we're off to Lebanon, where a decision by Saudi Arabia and a clutch of other Gulf countries has left the economy with a pretty negative outlook. And that's not just a phrase, that's the credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's, which has actually issued a negative outlook for Lebanon. Part of the reason, Saudi Arabia's decision to stop payment on $4 billion worth of military aid to Lebanon, but it's more because it's issued a travel ban for Saudi citizens, which Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE and Bahrain have all now emulated. Imtiaz Tayyab looks at the impact of the Gulf's great shutoff on Lebanon.
Banking is big business in Beirut. For decades, the sector has positioned itself as a hub for Middle East finance. The International Monetary Fund recently praised the industry for what it calls its durability and flexibility, despite Lebanon's history of conflict. But that seems to be changing. The US-based Standard & Poor's global credit rating agency has revised its long and short-term outlook for the Lebanese banking industry from stable to negative.
We have an absence of a president, and where the constitutional institutions like the parliament is not functioning. It is also due to to security risks that are the consequence of the war in Syria.
Downtown Beirut feels like one big building site these days. Over the past 10 years, old quarters have been beautifully restored and modern towers have been built where bombed-out buildings once stood. The prices for these newly built properties are high and few Lebanese can afford to buy here. But these developments are not marketed at locals. They are most often sold to wealthy buyers from the Gulf. According to government figures, Saudi Arabia alone accounts for 85% of foreigners investing in property in Lebanon. Their real estate holdings are valued at more than $6 billion. Still, it would appear Saudi interest in Lebanon's property market is declining sharply.
Losing a third of all revenue because of the war in neighboring Syria has hit farmers here hard. But a growing concern is the escalating diplomatic dispute between political leaders here in Lebanon and Gulf countries.
More than 3/4 of all agricultural exports from Lebanon are sent to Gulf states, which is why a series of recent decisions by Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies over the past month have farmers here worried. The Obama administration is reportedly pressuring Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies not to take further steps to punish Lebanon economically. So for now, farmers here say all they can do is continue to care for their crops.
We're not in a state of alarm, but a state of alert, according to the International Monetary Fund, which released its spring outlook this past week in Washington, D.C. But, you know, whatever you want to call it, the picture is still not a good one. Lower growth, political and financial turbulence, all combined, and the global economy is at risk of stalling. The headline figure is one of a slowing global economy, albeit only slightly, but it is the fourth one in a year, which is the concerning part, I guess. The world's growth outlook was trimmed to 3.2%, then with a view to picking up to 3.5% in 2017. The better news, though, was from China, where the IMF upgraded just by 0.2% its estimates for both 2016 and 2017. So we're looking at around 6.5% total growth there this year. And in fact, the news out of China itself was good too. Trade data showed exports in March grew by 11.5%, the biggest increase in overseas shipments since June last year, and at a time when China's focusing more, of course, on its domestic economy. And first quarter growth numbers also showed signs of stabilization, an expansion of 6.7%, which is the slowest quarterly growth in 7 years, but it's steady and it's in line with expectations. Joining us from London to talk about this is Andrew Kenningham, Senior Global Economist at Capital Economics. And you know, Andrew, I'm getting a bit bored of talking to economists about downward revisions and slow growth, and I'm sure you're sick of analysing it too, because it's just been going on so long now. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on what's going wrong. What are economies and what are governments, quote unquote, getting wrong, which is resulting in things not improving?
Well, partly what's going wrong is that the IMF and other forecasters are not adjusting to the new reality, which is that growth does seem to be lower than it was in the past. We seem not to be returning to the pre-crisis growth rates in advanced economies in particular. In addition, the IMF's forecasts for emerging economies are over-optimistic, and that's partly because the IMF is a bit constrained to use the official estimates of GDP growth in China in particular, but also in India. So, you know, they don't have the freedom which we have independently to come out with our own estimates of what the growth rate is, which is somewhat lower. So partly it's about the forecasting errors.
OK, this is interesting. I'd like to go into that a little bit more then. Do you think that the IMF then, or the likes of the IMF, are just too bullish, really? You know, they're trying to keep things on the positive side too much.
Well, I think their models and the way that they look at the world have always assumed that growth and various other economic variables will return to their long-run average rates. So that's quite a typical problem you get with economic forecasting. They've been slow, I think, to accept that things have changed. So that's one aspect, which is purely kind of technical thing. The other point is the IMF is not a completely independent body. Its main shareholders are the major governments of the world, and they tend to put a little pressure on, subtly or otherwise, for the fund's forecast to be at least in line with their own and not much weaker. I think that particularly applies with China. with some other countries as well.
So, okay, let's get into China then, because as you say, we're never quite sure about the official numbers that come out of there. What do you make, though, at least out of the numbers that you do see? Because, and I know I say this all the time, but it is the most important economy. It affects pretty much everyone else.
Yeah, so I think what's happened is that the Chinese economy slowed very sharply since 2010. So there was a big sort of a slowdown during the crisis. Then they had a massive stimulus package, grew very quickly in 2010. Since then, it's slowed from about 10% a year to, we think, about 5% a year. So it's been a really huge change and slowdown in China, and that's obviously had enormous effects all around the world, particularly for countries which rely on exporting commodities, because China's so important in the commodities market. What I think has not happened that people were worried about was that there might be a much sharper slowdown over the last 12 months or so. So we've seen various scares in financial markets about China since last summer, when the equity market fell. There have then been concerns about the exchange rate. And at the beginning of this year, people were really alarmed and thought there may again be another leg down in China's growth rate. In practice, we don't think that's happened. It's quite difficult, as you say, to read the numbers on China, and it's even in the best of times, it's even more difficult at this time of year because of the timing of the Chinese New Year celebrations, which move, because it's a lunar New Year, move from year to year, and they sort of screw up the statistics, if you pardon my language. You know, reading the tea leaves and looking, for example, at the trade numbers that came out earlier this week, our impression is that the growth rate probably held up at around about the 5% level in the first quarter of this year. So not as bad as people were fearing.
Andrew Kenningham, pleasure talking to you as always. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost.
All right, you're welcome.
Let's end this week's show in China's special administrative region of Hong Kong, famous for having the most skyscrapers of any city on earth, but maybe that's a bit of a facade. The property market is suffering from falling prices and economic uncertainty, and the slump is being described as a slow-motion train wreck. Sarah Clark reports now from Hong Kong.
This is central Hong Kong. It's the heart of the financial district. It's also home to some of the most expensive property in the world. But last month, the number of properties sold across the city reached a 25-year low.
It is a buyer's market right now as there are so many choices, but for the seller, they need to compete with other sellers as well as the developer.
Thomas Fock knows the market around central Hong Kong well, but he's yet to make a sale this year. This 3-bedroom apartment is 1,100 square feet and was bought 2 years ago for $5 million. He's now selling it at 30% less.
They may be in financial difficulties.
It's a market trend that looks set to continue in 2016. China's slowing economy and debt concerns about Chinese banks has only cautioned already nervous investors. Analysts say it won't be a crash, instead labelling it a slow-motion train wreck.
It has fallen by around 12% from the peak in September 2015. And we expect at least another 8% of a price correction in 2016.
Hong Kong is notorious for its booms and busts in real estate. And while those who bought at the peak time last September may be feeling the financial pain, the slowdown has also been considered a glimmer of hope for first home buyers who've so far been priced out of the market and investors wanting to buy back in. Kate Davies bought into the market late last year. She's been here for 20 years and this is her second purchase in Hong Kong. But she's the first to admit it's a challenging market to get started.
Well, I think the challenges are difficult for people who can't stump up with their 50% deposit. Once you've got over that burden, then it's a wonderful market to be involved in.
But even as the prices fall, they're still expensive on a global scale. Hong Kong has held the title of the most unaffordable property market in the world for 6 years in a row. It's not uncommon for entire families to live in these tiny apartments, often referred to as caged homes or subdivided flats.
In the past year, the number of people living in the big housing, this kind of poor conditions, increased, according to the government statistics.
The city's leader has pledged to tackle the problem, building more affordable housing over the next 5 years. But community groups are not holding their breath.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page with individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or just drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.